Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Today's video is the second one from the series of videos on history of English literature, and it is the second part of medieval age literature. Today we are going to know about Anglo-Norman period. The Norman conquest was the most important event in the history of England. Normans belonged to France. They crossed English Channel, attacked England in 1066, and won the Battle of Hastings under the leadership of William the Conqueror, who then became the King of England. Now, students, 1066 is taken as the dividing line between the old Anglo-Saxon England and the new Anglo-Norman England. Norman conquest imposed a French speaking ruलिंग क्लास ऑन इंग्लैंड. लैटिन वो ज़ुबान थी जिसमें नॉर्मन टाइम्स के कल्चर्ड मैन लिखा करते थे, जबकि फ्रेंच पोलाइट सोसाइटी में बोली जाती थी. एंग्लो फ्रेंच developed as the literary language of the highest social classes, and Anglo-Saxon was for the period relegated to the lower classes. पूरे यूरोप पर फ्रेंच कल्चर डोमिनेट कर रहा था और इंग्लिश लिटरेचर का कोर्स भी नॉर्मन कॉन्क्वेस्ट के बाद बहुत ज़्यादा डिसरप्ट हुआ. तकरीबन 2 सेंचुरीज तक जो लिटरेचर कोर्टली और अरिस्टोक्रेटिक पैट्रनेज के अंडर प्रोड्यूस हुआ वो फ्रेंच ही था, टोन में भी, लैंग्वेज में भी. जबकि इंग्लिश जो लिटरेचर है, इंग्लिश लैंग्वेज में लिटरेचर या तो वो रफ था और या पॉपुलर इस तरह से कि दैट वाज अंडरस्टूड बाय द कॉमन मैसेस, or it was written mostly by the lower clergy with the object of instructing the common people in biblical story and the duties required by their religion. So there was the domination of French culture on entire Europe and the literature produced in that age as well. एंग्लो सेक्सन एलिटरेटिव वर्ड्स जो सर्वाइविंग थी वो इतनी टेक्निकली सटल नहीं थी और दैट वाज मोर ससेप्टेबल टू द इन्फ्लुएंस ऑफ द फ्रेंच राइम्ड कपलेट. तो ये चेंज था उस दौर में. फिर नॉर्मन कॉन्क्वेस्ट इटसेल्फ वाज अ वेरी पावरफुल इवेंट इन द हिस्ट्री दैट इट had ended the Roman Empire completely and brought a new Europe into being. By the beginning of the 12th century, this new Europe had defined its relation to the Roman past and had established itself as a Christian civilization and had formed its own norms of politeness both in life and in letters. So, this is how French culture dominated and affected the language as well as so many other things in the society. The heroic age was gone, and a new kind of courtly sophistication replaced the heroic ideals in manners. French idealism, French feudalism had its effects. The worst tales of Charlemagne and his peers and Arthurian romances show that the new Europe of the Middle Ages was not a heroic society but a feudal society with its own conventions of service, honor, obligation, its own kind of literary patronage, and different social conditions. The French cultural influences changed the pattern of all medieval European literature. The story of English literature during the 2 centuries and a half after the Norman conquest is the story of what the late 17th century critics were to call, with reference to the achievements of their own poets, the refinement of our numbers. So it had a great influence on literature. Then, students, there was a time of rehabilitation of English. English literature soon began to rise again, slowly in the social scale, gradually acquiring an ease, a skill, and a polish which would enable it to stand on its own with French. The fullest and triumphant achievement of this new ease and skill and polish in the work of Chaucer coincides in date with the final re-establishment of English as the universal national language, the speech both written and spoken of both court and people. So English was again becoming the national language, and this was a rehabilitation of English. Now, students, how that rehabilitation came into being, because English remained the language of of the vast majority of the people. So eventually it won out over French, and by the beginning of the 14th century, the victory of the English language was clearly evident. But the English, which finally overcame French language, was changed in so many aspects. It was quite different from the former English because it had lost the Anglo-Saxon inflections or shades or accents, and then it had greatly enriched its vocabulary from French. So many French words were added to English, but it had not wholly lost touch with its traditions. Students, it is true that in English poetry, the rhymed verse of French soon replaced the Anglo Saxon alliterative tradition. There was a remarkable revival of alliterative verse in the 14th century. आपको याद होगा कि एंग्लो सैक्सन पोइट्री alliterative थी और वो विदाउट राइम थी, लेकिन फ्रेंच इन्फ्लुएंस की वजह से राइम वॉज इंट्रोड्यूस्ड, लेकिन फिर 14th सेंचुरी तक आते आते alliterative वर्ड्स का रिवाइवल देखने में आया. Although French influence brought a rhyme instead of alliteration to English poetry, and it restricted the range of prose, although the French language affected both the vocabulary and pronunciation of English, Middle English literature is in many important aspects the heir of its Anglo-Saxon ancestry. वही बात है कि फ्रेंच इन्फ्लुएंस चाहे कितना ही स्ट्रॉन्ग क्यों ना हो, इस इफ़ेक्ट की वजह से हमने नोट किया कि राइम इंट्रोड्यूस हुई और एलिट्रेशन की जगह राइम ने ली और वोकेबलरी और प्रोनाउंसिएशन में चेंजेस आई. लेकिन फिर भी मिडल इंग्लिश लिटरेचर को अगर देखें तो इसमें एंग्लो सैक्सन एंसेस्ट्री के एलिमेंट्स बहुत क्लियरली एविडेंट नज़र आते हैं. Students' friends started receding, it started moving back, and even among the upper classes, English moved slowly up in the social scale. So there was the possibility of a new standard form of literary English. And by the end of the Middle English period, English language reigned supreme. हुआ ये था कि मिडिल इंग्लिश पीरियड में इंग्लिश किंग्स चूँकि अपने आप को फ्रांस का भी राइटफुल किंग कंसिडर करते थे, सो जहाँ तक फ्रेंच कल्चर की डोमिनेंस की बात थी तो वो तो इंग्लैंड में काफ़ी अरसे तक अलाइव रहा, बट इट कुड नॉट प्रिवेंट द स्टडी राइज एंड डेवलपमेंट ऑफ इंग्लिश लैंग्वेज. ये इंग्लिश लैंग्वेज को डेवलप होने से रोक ना सका, और एक वक्त आया कि 14th सेंचुरी तक आते आते इंग्लिश अगेन बिकेम द पोलाइट एज वेल एज द पॉपुलर लैंग्वेज ऑफ इंग्लैंड. In 1385 AD, the ninth year of the reign of King Richard II, in all the grammar schools of England, children have abandoned French and translated and did their lessons in English. 1385 तक आते आते इंग्लैंड में इंग्लिश लेसन्स को कंपल्सरी कर दिया गया और फ्रेंच को अबेंडन कर दिया गया. English was introduced into the law courts in 1362. English was used for the first time in the opening of Parliament in 1363, and the work of Chaucer came in the immediately following decades. Thus, a social and cultural rehabilitation of English was achieved in the first half of the 14th century. A change in English language. The English language of 14th century was different from that of Beowulf. Means Beowulf की लैंग्वेज ओल्ड इंग्लिश लैंग्वेज एंग्लो सैक्सन लैंग्वेज थी, जबकि 14th सेंचुरी की इंग्लिश काफ़ी हद तक चेंज हो चुकी थी बिकॉज ऑफ द एडिशन ऑफ French words. Then there were changes in pronunciation and there were changes in word structure as well. But at this stage, we should say that it was the legitimate descendant of its Anglo-Saxon parent, and these changes were naturally to take place with the passage of time. Language में वक्त के गुजरने के साथ साथ इतनी changes आना, that is quite natural. Now, students, I hope you have understood today's lecture. Basically, I intended to cover Anglo-Norman literature also in this video, but this video was going to be very long in that case. So, I am concluding it here at this point, and we are going to discuss about Anglo-Norman literature in the next video. Till then, wish you all the best. Allah Hafiz.